Hello, dear friends. Make yourselves comfortable, dim the lights, close your eyes, and prepare for a journey. A journey not to distant lands, but to a world invisible to the naked eye, a world teeming with life all around and inside us, in every speck of dust, in a drop of water, in the stream of air we breathe. This is the story of a great war that has been raging for billions of years. A war between invisible armies. Some bring disease and death, others healing and life. And this is the story of one man, an absent-minded scientist with the soul of an artist, who became an accidental general in this war. His name was Alexander Fleming, but our story does not begin in his famous laboratory, not in gleaming, sterile halls. It begins where death from an invisible enemy was most agonizing and obvious. In the damp, filthy trenches of the First World War, picture this scene: knee-deep mud, a penetrating dampness that seeps into your bones, the moans of the wounded mixed with the roar of artillery. A young captain of the medical service, Alexander Fleming, walks through the dressing stations, and he is powerless. He sees soldiers who survived being wounded by shrapnel die in agony a day later, 2 days later. Their wounds, seemingly not fatal, begin to redden, swell, ooze foul pus. A fever rises, delirium sets in. It's gas gangrene, it's sepsis, blood poisoning. And against this, Fleming and his colleagues have almost no weapons. They douse the wounds with caustic antiseptics, carbolic acid, but Fleming notices a terrible thing. These fluids not only kill the microbes killers, they also burn the living, healthy tissues of the body, the leukocytes, those very tiny defenders trying to fight the infection. It's like putting out a fire with acid while burning down the entire house. It was there, in that hell, that Fleming was seized by a burning, obsessive desire to find a way, to find a magic bullet that would strike only the enemy without harming the body of the host. He did not yet know what it would look like. He didn't even know if it existed at all. But he made a vow to himself to find it. This dream, born in the chaos of the trenches, would lead him years later to one of the greatest discoveries in human history. And all thanks to his attentiveness and his famous, almost legendary, untidiness. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand the man, one must understand where he came from. Let us transport ourselves from the gloom of the trenches to the clean, transparent air of Scotland, to a small farm where young Alec was just beginning to explore the world. The distant year of 1881. Ayrshire in the west of Scotland. Rolling meadows, emerald green, a piercing blue sky, and low-hanging, fluffy clouds. Here, at Lotchfield Farm, in a large and friendly family, grew the 7th child, Alexander Fleming. Everyone simply called him Alec. His world was one of simple and eternal things. The smell of damp earth after rain, the warm flank of a cow at dawn, the pungent taste of fresh milk. From early childhood, he was unusually observant and patient for his age. While other boys ran wild in the fields, Alec could squat for hours by a stream, watching how the water flowed around pebbles, how blades of grass swirled in an eddy, how water striders skated on the surface. Once, after a heavy downpour, he found a large puddle with leaves, sand, and other forest debris floating in it. He scooped some of the water into an old mug and brought it home. By the light of a kerosene lamp, he examined it, trying to understand what made this water so alive, so dynamic. Of course, he had no microscope. His first microscope was his own eyes, his curiosity, and his imagination. His father, William Fleming, was a stern but fair man. He taught Alec the main farming rule. To get a result, you must apply persistent, methodical labor. You can't plow a field in one day. You can't harvest a crop in 1 hour. Everything requires time, patience, and attention to detail. Miss one weeding, and the weeds will choke the crops. Neglect a sick sheep, and you'll lose the whole flock. These lessons were forever imprinted on the boy's mind. Perseverance and attention to detail would become his main scientific tools in the future. His schoolteacher, Mr. McLean, immediately discerned an extraordinary mind in the quiet Alec. He brought him books that went beyond the standard curriculum. And one day, it was a fateful event. He showed him a real, albeit simple, educational microscope. Alec froze, peering into the eyepiece. A drop of water from that very puddle turned out to be not just murky liquid, but a whole metropolis. Myriads of tiny creatures swam, writhed, collided, and chased each other. It was a whole cosmos in a single drop. It was a miracle more captivating than any fairy tale. That day, the world for Alec Fleming split in two. The visible, large, understandable, made of hills, trees, and people, and the invisible, mysterious, bustling, full of enigmas, hidden on the surface of everything he touched. He did not yet know that his entire life would be dedicated to studying this invisible world, and that one day he would find in it not only enemies, but also humanity's greatest ally. But the path to that discovery lay far from the Scottish hills. He was destined to exchange the cozy, predictable world of the farm for the noisy, smoky, opportunity-filled London of the late 19th century, met the young Fleming with a deafening roar, coal smog, and a frantic pace of life. After the vast expanses of Ayrshire, the city seemed like a giant, gray labyrinth. At 13, following his older brothers Tom and John, Alexander moved to the capital. At first, He lived in the house of his eldest brother Tom, who had already made successful strides in medicine and was an unquestionable authority for Alec. First, he needed to earn a living. He got a job as a clerk in a shipping company. The work was monotonous, boring to the point of teeth gnashing. Whole days were spent copying bills, invoices, and bills of lading. His lively, inquisitive mind languished in a cage of numbers and ledgers. He performed his duties conscientiously, but without any enthusiasm. This was not his path. He felt like a bird in a cage, looking at the sky. He was saved by chance. In 1901, when he was 20, he received a small inheritance, £250. For the time, this was a considerable sum, a veritable fortune that opened doors for him. Most young men in his place would probably have spent it on settling down or entertainment. But Alex saw in this money not an opportunity for comfort, but an opportunity for choice. A ticket to a different life. He watched the successes of his brother Tom, who had become a respected London ophthalmologist. The profession of a doctor seemed noble, full of meaning, and most importantly, it was connected with the mysteries of life, with that very invisible world that had beckoned him since childhood. Medicine was a bridge between the two worlds he knew, and he made his choice. He left the hated office and used his entire inheritance to pay for his studies at the medical school of St. Mary's Hospital. It was a risk. It was a leap into the unknown, but it was a leap toward his dream. From the very beginning of his studies, he proved himself a brilliant, though unusual, student. He had a phenomenal visual memory and a feel for bacteria. In exams, he didn't just memorize facts. He understood the logic of the processes occurring in the body and the microcosm. He won numerous prizes and scholarships, becoming the top student of his cohort. In 1906, he became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and decided to devote himself to a career as a surgeon. It seemed a logical step. Surgery was precise, swift, requiring a steady hand and a clear mind. But fate, as it often does, had a different scenario prepared for him. He was invited to join the St. Mary's Hospital rifle team. He was an excellent shot, a hobby that remained with him from his farming days, and the team's leader was a man who would become his teacher, mentor, and determine his entire future path. His name was Sir Almroth Wright. It was in the laboratory of Almroth Wright, this wizard of vaccination, that Fleming found his true calling. The laboratory became his new home, and Petri dishes and test tubes his new field for observation. Sir Almroth Wright's laboratory at St. Mary's was a special place. It was the kingdom of immunology, the new and exciting science of how the body protects itself from disease. Wright himself was a charismatic, authoritative, and brilliant scientist. He was obsessed with one idea: vaccination. He believed that one could train a person's immune system, prepare it to meet the enemy by introducing weakened bacteria. When Fleming first crossed its threshold, his sense of smell was assaulted by a strange mixture of smells: the Swedish spirit of nutrient broths, the sharp scent of disinfectants, and the faint smell of old paper and dust. Everywhere stood test tubes in racks, rows of Petri dishes with agar on which grew multicolored bacterial colonies, some yellow as butter, others white as grains of sugar, others red like droplets of blood. It was the palette of an invisible artist. Wright immediately recognized a rare talent in Fleming. He was not just a technical executor. He had a special intuition. He set up experiments with elegance and simplicity, and his hands were unusually dexterous. He could do what seemed impossible to others, like taking tiny bacterial samples from one dish and transferring them to another, almost without looking. Fleming became Wright's assistant, and then his right-hand man. He immersed himself in the study of the immune system, in experiments with vaccines against typhoid and cholera. He developed new, more precise methods of blood analysis and vaccination, which became the gold standard in medicine. But there was one trait of Fleming's that drove his more pedantic colleagues crazy. His desk, his corner in the laboratory, was a creative chaos. While other scientists kept their desks in sterile cleanliness, Fleming worked amidst clutter. Petri dishes he used in experiments stood on his desk for weeks, sometimes months, gathering dust and sometimes new, unintended life. Colleagues grumbled. "Fleming, clear up this mess," he often heard. But he would just wave them off. He believed that an unexpected find could be hiding in this chaos. He threw nothing away until he was absolutely sure there was nothing interesting left. For him, the laboratory was not a factory for producing data, but a workshop where one must look closely, wait, and allow nature itself to reveal its secrets. This untidiness of his was not laziness, but a method. The method of a patient observer, a farmer who does not pull up a plant by the roots to see how it grows, but waits for it to mature and bear fruit itself. It was this method, born on a Scottish farm and nurtured in Wright's laboratory, that would lead him to two great discoveries. The first one was made almost by accident, and it became the dress rehearsal for the main breakthrough. But before we move on to it, let us briefly return to those very trenches where our story began. Because it was the horror of war that gave his search the very sense of purpose that ultimately led to success. The laboratory's peace, with its smell of carbolic acid and nutrient broths, remained in another. almost forgotten world. Now Captain Alexander Fleming breathed air thick with the fumes of churned-up earth, corrosion, sweat, and a sickly sweet, revolting smell of rotting flesh. This smell hung over the field hospital, set up in a half-destroyed barn somewhere in France, and it seeped into clothing, into skin, into the very consciousness. Here, at the front line, his carefully constructed scientific knowledge, acquired from Wright, collided with an ugly and merciless reality. He saw not abstract bacteria in a petri dish, but their work living, swift, and deadly. Ragged wounds contaminated with soil from shrapnel and shell fragments were an ideal incubator for anaerobic bacteria, those that didn't need oxygen, Clostridium bacteria, causing gas gangrene, thrived in crushed, blood-deprived tissues, producing gas bubbles that oozed with a nasty squelch under the skin of dying soldiers. Fleming watched as his fellow doctors, desperately trying to clean a wound, poured the same caustic antiseptics that had seemed a panacea in London: carbolic acid, mercury chloride, chloride of lime. And he, with his penchant for precise observation, saw the horrifying consequences. The antiseptic, like a blunt and cruel soldier, could not penetrate the deepest recesses of the wound, where the cunning and elusive enemy was hiding, yet it effectively and indiscriminately scorched the leukocytes, the white blood cells, that very natural, nature-created army of the organism that was desperately trying to fight the infection. It damaged healthy, living tissues, further impeding the already compromised blood flow and creating even more comfortable anaerobic conditions for the bacteria. Once, watching a young doctor diligently pour a concentrated solution of carbolic acid into a deep wound in a soldier's thigh, Fleming couldn't stand it. His quiet, usually restrained voice sounded sharp and bitter in the oppressive silence of the dressing station. "Can't you see? You're just poisoning the man himself. Your antiseptic," he paused, looking at the bottle, "is only good for pouring on a soldier's boots, not into his wound." This phrase, born of despair and powerlessness, was not just a protest or heresy. It was a statement of the collapse of an entire medical paradigm. Fleming understood what seemed unthinkable to others, blinded by tradition. Antiseptics, applied in such a barbaric manner, did more harm than good. They were poisoning the patient himself without reaching the true culprit, the infection, securely hidden deep within the body. He began conducting experiments right there, in hell, using the simple pipettes he had brought with him, and a few petri dishes with nutrient agar. He took samples from the deepest parts of the wounds of dying soldiers, showing that even in high dilutions, antiseptics were unable to kill bacteria when mixed with proteins, pus, and tissue fluid. His own research conducted in unbearable conditions, confirmed he was right. He saw how in a dish where he had dropped antiseptic, the bacteria died only at the edges, while in the center, mimicking the depth of a wound, they continued to grow vigorously. But what could he offer in return? For now, nothing. And this was his main torment, his personal tragedy. He was a prophet, seeing the demise of the old world, but unable to build a new one. He saw the problem clearly, as never before, but saw no solution. He was like a commander who had finally deciphered the enemy's tactics, but had no army or weapons to counter them. All he could do was alleviate suffering, performing wound debridement, excising dead tissue, giving the weakened organism a shadow of a chance to cope with the infection itself. But too often, this chance proved illusory. It was in these dark days, steeped in pain and death, that a clear, oath-like image of a goal was etched into his mind, as if on steel. He needed to find a substance, not just an antiseptic, but something else, a powerful antibacterial agent that would be absolutely harmless to human tissues. A substance that could travel with the bloodstream like a messenger, reach the most remote, most hidden foci of infection, and strike the enemy precisely, selectively, without causing the slightest harm to the host. He mentally called it the magic bullet. This magic bullet became his obsession, his holy grail. He carried this idea with him out of the trench hell when the war finally ended, and brought it back to London, to his old laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital. Now, he had not just scientific curiosity. He had a mission, hard won, and paid for with the lives of those he could not save. And a few years later, in 1921, thanks to his famous absent-mindedness and acute, almost mystical powers of observation, the first miracle occurred, a small, imperfect one, not the one he dreamed of, but incredibly important. It became a glimmer in the darkness, proof that nature held amazing secrets. The year 1922. The St. Mary's Laboratory was again his refuge, his kingdom. The war was gradually receding into the past, turning into a heavy, but still, a dream. Fleming returned to his usual rhythm, endless experiments, lectures for students, leisurely conversations with Sir Almroth Wright, and of course, his famous, living, breathing, creative mess on his desk. That day, he was working with cultures of micrococci, harmless bacteria he used in routine experiments. Petri dishes with transparent agar and yellowish, like scattered semolina, colonies stood before him. He had a cold, an ordinary autumn runny nose. Leaning over another dish to make a note, he felt a familiar tickling urge in his nose. He didn't have time to turn away. A light sneeze, and a tiny, almost invisible drop of mucus from his nose fell right onto the surface of the agar, onto the neat rows of bacterial colonies. A scene worthy of a farce. Any other scientist, any assistant, discovering such an unforgivable contamination of a sample, would have frowned with annoyance, muttered something unflattering about carelessness, and sent the dish for disinfection. But not Fleming. For him, such accidents were not annoying mistakes, but hints from fate itself, doors slightly ajar into an unknown world. Contamination was an opportunity. He did not throw the dish away. Instead, with curiosity, like an archaeologist who had found a strange artifact, he carefully labeled it and left it on his desk, in one of the numerous archaeological layers of his clutter, to observe. Several days passed, perhaps a week. He was sorting through the accumulations of his long-term projects, and his gaze fell again on that very dish. And then he saw something that must have made his heart stop for a moment, then beat with furious force around the spot where the drop had fallen. The bacteria had not just died. They dissolved, disappeared, as if erased by an eraser. In their place was a clean, transparent, sterile zone, sharply contrasting with the scattering of living yellow colonies around. "This is it." This exclamation surely sounded in his mind. Could it be? Could it be that in ordinary human mucus, in this product of a cold, there was some substance capable of not just killing, but destroying, dissolving bacteria? His mind, trained on Wright's ideas about immunity, immediately seized on this thread. Maybe this was that very natural antiseptic produced by the body itself. He repeated the experiment deliberately, without sneezing, carefully introducing samples of his nasal mucus into dishes with bacteria. The result was stable and astounding. Then he began methodically checking other biological fluids, saliva, tears, blood, even chicken egg white. The effect, which he called lysis, dissolution, was observed everywhere, but it was especially powerful in tears. Here, one of the legends surrounding great discoveries was born. It was said that for a large-scale experiment, he needed many tears, and he persuaded his assistant, or in some sources, his wife Sarah, to help science. He used a harmless but effective irritant, a slice of lemon, squeezing its juice into her eyes, and carefully collected the precious, pure tears in a sterile pipette. It sounds a bit cruel today, but for the science of that time, devoid of modern ethics committees, it was par for the course. And her tears, like his own mucus, gave a brilliant result, a clean zone of lysis on the dish with bacteria. Fleming was elated. He had discovered a natural antibacterial enzyme, which he solemnly named lysozyme, from the Greek words lysis, dissolution, and zyme, enzyme. He wrote enthusiastic articles, gave lectures, calling it a natural antiseptic, that very defender hidden in our own fluids. It seemed, here it was, the first clue. A magic bullet of our own production, harmless to tissues, since it was their natural part, and yet capable of destroying bacteria. But as often happens in science, the elation was short-lived. Further, more thorough research brought bitter, cold disappointment. Lysozyme turned out to be a picky and, alas, ineffective guardian. It coped excellently with harmless saprophytic bacteria, the very micrococci with which it all began, but it was practically powerless against the main killers of the time, the sinister Staphylococcus aureus, the cunning Streptococcus, causing sepsis, or the deadly pneumococcus. It was like a gatekeeper who was great at shooing away annoying beggars, but faltered before well-armed and determined bandits breaking down the gates. This discovery, although extremely important from a fundamental scientific point of view, again did not solve the main problem, the one he had brought from the trenches. Fleming was again at a dead end. Lysozyme became a beautiful, elegant, but practically useless trophy. Another unfulfilled hope, another step that did not lead to the desired goal. Many scientists in his place would have given up, deciding that nature was too cunning, and the magic bullet was just a mirage. But Fleming was not like that. His stubbornness was that of a Scottish farmer cultivating stony soil for years. His patience was that of an observer who can wait for hours by a burrow to see an animal. He did not throw away his lysozyme dishes. He simply set them aside into that very creative chaos on his desk that was his strategy. He continued to believe that the answer was somewhere nearby, that one only needed to wait for the right moment and be able to see it. And he would see it. After 6 long, seemingly barren years, in that very forgotten, dusty Petri dish, which would become the most famous dish in the history of medicine, an icon that changed the course of human history. But before that moment, he had to endure years of apparent stagnation, years when his work on lysozyme elicited only polite, condescending smiles from colleagues. "How is your natural antiseptic, Fleming?" Still fighting harmless microbes, he sometimes heard. Years when his laboratory increasingly resembled the shop of an ancient alchemist, cluttered with strange vessels, dusty relics of past experiments, and miracles quietly waiting for their hour. If there had been strict services monitoring the sanitary condition of workplaces at that time, Fleming's laboratory would surely have been closed in disgrace, with an order for complete and total disinfection posted on the door. But for him, this office with its high ceiling and cluttered tables was a sacred chaos. his personal universe, a map of the invisible world. One must imagine it in all its detail, a long wooden table, stained with chemicals, scratches, and ink blots. It was littered with dozens, if not hundreds, of Petri dishes. They stood in stacks, lay mixed with papers, lay next to the microscope. Some were fresh, with neat, parade-ground circles of growing bacteria. Others had been standing for weeks, their agar drying out, cracking, shriveling, and the bacterial colonies fading and dying of thirst. Still others, the most interesting, were covered with bizarre spots of multicolored mold, emerald green, velvety blue, coal black, white as down. To an outsider's eye, to any pedant, this was simply dirt, a sign of laziness and sloppiness. For Fleming, it was an invaluable collection, a collection of failures, accidents, strange interactions, and potential discoveries. He was a collector of anomalies. His faithful assistants, Merlin Price and Stuart Craddock, had long since come to terms with their boss's habits. They learned the iron rule. One must not tidy the desk, wash, or throw away old dishes without his direct and unambiguous permission. Fleming often wandered between these stacks, like a gardener between beds, or a hunter in the thicket, peering intently at each one. His blue eyes, usually absent-minded in everyday life, became keen and focused here. He was looking for deviations from the norm. He was looking for what stood out from the usual, boring picture. A spot where bacteria didn't grow, a light ring around a mold colony. Any trifle, any glitch in the program. He was not a pedant in the classical sense. He didn't write everything down in a thick journal with triple checks and certifying signatures. He worked intuitively, relying on his phenomenal memory and instinct. His method was that of a 19th century naturalist, not a 20th century engineer. He allowed nature to do its work, while he acted as an attentive, patient, and unbiased spectator. He believed that the greatest discoveries come not when you persistently search for them, directing all resources at the target, but when you are attentive enough to notice the unexpected, that which falls outside the logic. Chance, he said, favors the prepared mind. And his mind and his laboratory were prepared for a rendezvous with chance like no other. Colleagues from other departments, popping in on business, would just shake their heads. Old man Fleming and his museum of mold, they would say with a smirk, hurrying back to their sterile, orderly offices. But he paid no attention. He had his own truth, hard-won in the trenches. The war had taught him that traditional, straightforward methods were useless against the intricacies of life. So, one had to look for detours. One had to create an environment where nature itself could manifest itself, show its cards. The summer of 1928 turned out to be surprisingly cool and rainy for London. Atlantic winds brought moisture and chill. The windows in the laboratory in his office were often wide open, letting in fresh, damp air. Myriads of invisible travelers, mold spores, pollen, bacteria, microscopic particles of life flew freely in the air currents, entered the building, and settled on any suitable surface, including the stacks of Petri dishes standing on the table by the sink. At the end of July, or the very beginning of August, Fleming decided to take a short vacation with his family at a country house. Before leaving, he worked, as usual, with cultures. A stack of used Petri dishes, which he planned to wash someday, remained in their usual place near the sink. Among them was an unremarkable dish with a culture of Staphylococcus aureus, that very killer microbe that caused the most severe purulent infections, abscesses, sepsis, the very diseases from which soldiers died in the trenches, and which his beloved lysozyme could not touch. He left, leaving his laboratory, his museum, in the care of time, weather, and blind chance. He did not know that these three mysterious allies were preparing for him the greatest gift of his life, a gift that he alone in the whole world was capable of unwrapping and appreciating correctly. The first days of September 1928. London still held the coolness of the departed summer. Alexander Fleming returned from his vacation, rested with renewed energy. His laboratory greeted him with familiar chaos and silence. Dust motes danced in the rays of light falling from the high window. The first thing he did was to put things in order, or the semblance of it that he recognized. This meant sorting through the piles on his desk, where fresh notes, letters, and stacks of old Petri dishes were mixed together. He went through them one by one, glancing briefly, deciding the fate of each, to wash or to leave for further observation. Next to him, as often happened, was his former assistant, now colleague, Dr. Merlin Price. They talked, discussed the latest news. The work proceeded unhurriedly. And then Fleming's hand reached for the next stack, the one by the sink. These were dishes with Staphylococcus cultures, left behind before his departure. Most of them were uniformly covered with a thick, golden yellow film of bacteria, a familiar and expected picture. But one dish caught his attention. It was contaminated. On its surface, a lush, untidy spot of mold had grown, gray, velvety. It had captured a significant part of the agar. And around this moldy island, something inexplicable was happening. The Staphylococcus aureus, usually invincible and aggressive, had not just retreated, it had disappeared. Around the mold stretched a wide, clean, transparent zone, as if someone had drawn a magical protective circle with chalk, inside which the bacteria dared not enter. And further beyond this boundary, they grew as if nothing had happened, thick and golden. Anyone in Price's place, seeing such a contaminated culture, would probably have said, "Well, there you go, contamination again, have to wash it." But Fleming did not say that. He froze. His gaze, always absent-minded, became sharp and focused. He did not see dirt. He saw a phenomenon. He saw an anomaly. He saw a war frozen in Agar, where one invisible army had completely defeated another. "How interesting," he said thoughtfully, turning the dish in his hands, catching the light at different angles. These words, quiet and devoid of pathos, became one of the most famous phrases in the history of science. Behind them was not a cry of Eureka. There was a deep, genuine curiosity. His mind, tuned to the search for the magic bullet, instantly clicked. Lysozyme dissolved harmless bacteria. This mold was suppressing the most formidable causative agent of purulent infections. He showed the dish to Price. "Look at this," he said. "This is interesting. Remember my lysozyme? The same story, but with a much more dangerous opponent." Instead of sending the dish to the sink, Fleming carefully preserved it. He understood that he was holding not a flawed sample, but a key. Perhaps the very one he had been searching for all these years. Now the real work began. The first task was to identify the unexpected ally. Fleming carefully took a sample of the mold and transferred it to a clean dish with nutrient broth. He placed it in an incubator, and soon it grew into a lush, velvety colony. At first it was white, then it acquired a dark green color, and a beautiful golden yellow pigment appeared on the reverse side of the dish. He took the sample to the laboratory of a mycologist, which was one floor below. The specialist looked at the culture and identified it without difficulty. It was a mold of the genus Penicillium, more precisely, Penicillium notatum. Perhaps its spore, caught by the wind, had flown in through the open window from the mycologist's laboratory and found a home in Fleming's forgotten dish. So chance and necessity met at one point in space and time. Now it had a name, and Fleming gave a name to the substance it produced. He called it penicillin. The following weeks were filled with persistent, methodical labor. Fleming and his assistants set about studying the properties of the mysterious substance. They grew the mold in large flasks with broth, then filtered it, obtaining a pure, yellowish liquid containing penicillin. They conducted experiments. A drop of this liquid, placed in a dish with pathogenic bacteria, created that same sterile zone around itself. And most importantly, penicillin worked against those very bacteria that lysozyme was powerless against. against staphylococci, streptococci, pneumococci, the causative agents of anthrax. But at the same time, as was found in the first crude experiments, it was of low toxicity to animals and to human leukocytes. This was exactly the magic bullet he had dreamed of, one that killed the enemy but spared the host. He conducted a famous experiment that would later be reproduced in many photographs. He cut a piece of agar with the mold growing on it and placed it in the center of a dish seeded with different types of bacteria. After a day, the picture was astounding. From the piece of mold, sterile zones radiated out in all directions, like rays from a star, while the rest of the dish was thickly overgrown. Each ray was directed at a specific type of bacteria, and the length of the ray showed how effective penicillin was against that species. It was a visual and beautiful atlas of antibacterial power. Fleming's enthusiasm grew with each day. It seemed here was the solution. But very soon he encountered problems that seemed insurmountable. Penicillin was an unstable and capricious substance. Fleming, being a brilliant bacteriologist, but not a strong chemist, could not isolate it in pure form. His preparations were crude extracts, an unclean mixture where the active substance quickly lost its strength. It could not be stored for long. It could not be injected into the blood, only applied topically. The first case of medical application was modest. His assistant, Stuart Craddock, suffered from severe sinusitis. Fleming treated his sinuses with his penicillin extract. Craddock's condition improved, but not for long. The treatment was unpleasant and did not lead to a complete cure. It was a hint of success, but not a triumph. The next patient was a small boy dying from a staphylococcal blood infection. Fleming managed to obtain a somewhat more purified penicillin. It was applied topically to the foci of infection, and even a few injections were given into a vein. The child began to recover. But the supply of penicillin ran out, the infection returned, and the boy died. This tragedy showed Fleming two things. Penicillin worked, even when injected into the blood. But to save a life, industrial quantities were needed, which he was unable to produce. In 1929, he published an article about his discovery in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. The article was received by the scientific community politely, but without much enthusiasm. Colleagues saw the same problem: instability, difficulty of production, impossibility of isolation in pure form. Penicillin remained a curious laboratory phenomenon, a scientific oddity. Interest in it faded for almost 10 years. Fleming did not abandon his research. He continued to use the penicillin extract as a topical antiseptic for treating wounds and ulcers. With varying success, he preserved the strain of his magical mold, and from time to time passed it on to other scientists who showed interest. But no breakthrough occurred. Penicillin fell into a lethargic sleep, like the Sleeping Beauty, awaiting its princes who would awaken it and reveal its true power to the world. Those princes turned out to be two scientists from Oxford who, a decade later, stumbled upon Fleming's old article and saw in it what others had not: colossal, untapped potential. Spring 1940, the air in Oxford was filled with anxiety. The war, which had previously seemed a distant threat, had become a harsh reality. Airplanes flew over the city, and in the laboratory of the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, an atmosphere reminiscent of a besieged fortress reigned. Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and their small team worked under constant time pressure. Understanding that their research could be crucial for saving thousands of lives on the battlefields that everyone knew were inevitable, after many months of titanic, almost heroic labor, which included countless failures, spilled reagents, and nights spent at the laboratory bench, Chain and his group managed to achieve the nearly impossible, using an extraction method with amyl acetate and subsequent lyophilization, freeze-drying. They obtained a small amount of a brownish, hygroscopic powder. This was not pure penicillin. Its activity was only about 1% of the powder's mass, but it was a huge step forward compared to Fleming's unstable liquids. In those few milligrams of brown dust lay potential life. This amount was catastrophically small for human trials, but it was enough for a decisive, impeccably planned experiment on animals. The goal was simple and cruel: to prove that penicillin could save a life from a fatal systemic infection, not just work locally on a wound surface. The plan for the experiment, devised by Florey, was a model of scientific rigor. They selected 8 healthy, adult white mice. All 8 animals were injected intraperitoneally with a lethal dose of hemolytic streptococcus, a bacterium from which there was no escape, and which guaranteed 100% mortality within 48 hours. It was a death sentence. The mice were then divided into 2 groups. 4 mice became the control group. They received no treatment. Their fate was predetermined, and they served as grim confirmation of the infection's lethality. The other 4 mice became the experimental group. Exactly 1 hour after infection, when the bacteria had already begun their victorious march through the bloodstream, they received their first injection of the penicillin solution. And here the most difficult part began. The supply of the precious drug was so small and its half-life in the mouse body so short that injections had to be given every 3 hours, day and night. The team Florey, Chain, and their faithful assistants set up a strict duty schedule. The laboratory became their home, their headquarters, their battlefield. They slept in fits and starts on camp beds, waking to an alarm clock to give the next injection, carefully recording the condition of each mouse. 10 hours passed. The mice in the control group began to show signs of illness. They became lethargic, their fur ruffled. The mice in the experimental group were still holding on. 16 hours. The control mice lay still, breathing heavily, almost motionless. The experimental ones were still relatively active. Tension in the laboratory reached its peak. The scientists, red-eyed from sleeplessness, whispered, afraid to jinx the fragile hope. The outcome became clear by the morning of the next day. When the first ray of light fell into the laboratory window, the picture was both shocking and triumphant. The 4 mice in the control group were dead. Their little bodies lay motionless, a stark and ruthless confirmation of the infection's power. And the 4 mice that had received penicillin were alive. Moreover, they weren't just breathing, they were active, drinking water, interested in food, their fur smooth and clean. They looked perfectly healthy. Penicillin had not just prolonged their agony, it had completely destroyed the deadly infection, allowing their own immune systems to recover. At that moment, in the cramped, chemical-smelling Oxford laboratory, under the muffled rumble of airplanes flying somewhere, a new era in medicine was born. The era of antibiotics. For the first time in history, it was indisputably and elegantly proven that a substance produced by a simple mold could, traveling with the bloodstream, find and destroy deadly bacteria inside a living organism without causing it substantial harm. This was Fleming's very magic bullet. But now it was not just a dream, but a tangible, albeit tiny, amount of brown powder. Enthusiasm in the team soared, but the triumph was overshadowed by harsh reality. To save people, kilograms, not milligrams, of penicillin were needed. Their makeshift pans and milk, churns in which they grew the mold, were categorically unsuitable for this. The war, already raging in Europe, demanded the medicine now, not in a decade. And they again hit the same wall as Fleming, but now with much greater stubbornness and much more powerful tools. Summer 1941, Britain stood alone. The fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the blockade, the war had become total. Losses in North Africa and at sea were mounting, and the need for an effective antimicrobial drug that could save the wounded from gas gangrene and sepsis turned from a scientific task into a matter of national survival. Florey's team understood that on a besieged island, with its limited resources and constant threat of bombing, they would never be able to establish mass production. A fateful, though bitter for British patriots, decision was made to go overseas, to the neutral and colossally industrially powerful United States, to persuade the Americans to join the effort. In the summer of 1941, Florey and Heatley, the most practical and inventive member of the team, embarked on a dangerous journey across the Atlantic, teeming with German U-boat wolf packs. Heatley, with his famous thriftiness and paranoia, became the chief keeper of the most valuable cargo. He took with him several test tubes with the precious strain of Penicillium notatum. Realizing the ship could be torpedoed, he devised a cunning plan. He smeared the test tubes with brown paint to make them look inconspicuous, and persuaded his traveling companions to hide them in different places in their luggage. According to one legend, he even suggested that Florey sail on different ships, so that if one perished, the other would still deliver the priceless strain to America. It was a mission worthy of a spy novel. Their mission in the USA was crowned with success, though not instantaneously. They managed to interest influential scientists from the Rockefeller Foundation, and then the U.S. government, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and America's entry into the war. Penicillin research was classified as top secret and given the highest priority. Giants of the American pharmaceutical industry joined the effort. Pfizer, Merck, Squibb. The task was clearly formulated to turn a laboratory method into an industrial technology. American scientists and engineers attacked the problem with the typical New World scale. They understood that the Oxford method of growing mold in flat glass vessels was a dead end. They needed to find more productive strains and more efficient fermentation methods. A real hunt for mold began. From all over the world, samples of soil, moldy fruits, and vegetables were brought to the research laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. Hundreds of employees, many of them women lab technicians, nicknamed mold ladies, tested new strains daily. And then, one of them, Mary Hunt, brought in a cantaloupe bought at a local market for analysis. It was covered with a beautiful golden mold. The strain isolated from this melon and named Penicillium chrysogenum, the golden one, turned out to be hundreds of times more productive than its Oxford ancestor. This was the first key breakthrough. The second, no less important discovery was the transition from surface to deep fermentation. American engineers, particularly the Pfizer company, which had vast experience in industrial fermentation for producing citric acid, proposed growing the mold not on the surface, but deep within the nutrient medium in huge steel fermentation tanks holding tens of thousands of liters. Sterile air was constantly bubbled through this medium, which sharply accelerated the growth of the mold and the production of penicillin. This was the transition from craft production to industrial by 1943. Thanks to the titanic efforts of thousands of people, American industry was producing enough penicillin to supply the Allied armies. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the stockpile of penicillin was so large that it could be given to all the seriously wounded. It saved countless lives from gangrene and sepsis, becoming one of the strategic assets that brought victory closer. The Sleeping Beauty, awakened by Fleming and cherished by the Oxford scientists, was not just awakened. She was put on a giant industrial conveyor belt that changed the face of medicine and the world. And so came the year 1945. The war, which had caused so much pain and been a catalyst for so many discoveries, was coming to an end. The world, battered and exhausted, was trying to heal its wounds. And in this new, fragile world, 3 men, whose work had saved countless lives and continued to save them every day, received the highest scientific recognition. In Stockholm, in the shining light of the ceremony, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to 3 men: Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain. It would seem a perfect, happy ending, a story worthy of a storyteller's pen. A modest scientist makes a chance discovery. It is saved from oblivion by brilliant followers, and they all receive their deserved reward. But my dear listeners, real life is always more complex and multifaceted than any fairy tale. And this story, like any other, has its shadows. Imagine yourself in the place of each of them that evening in Stockholm. Alexander Fleming, a modest, somewhat awkward Scot who never sought fame. Suddenly, he became a world celebrity, the father of penicillin. Newspapers all over the world glorified him alone, often forgetting to mention Florey and Chain. His portrait was printed on front pages. He was besieged by reporters. For a man who felt more comfortable in the company of Petri dishes than at social soirees, this fame became a heavy burden. He was the symbol of the discovery. But deep down he understood that without the titanic work of the Oxford group, his penicillin would have remained a curious oddity in the history of science. He received recognition he perhaps never dreamed of, but this recognition was largely undeservedly attributed to him alone. Howard Florey, a cold, pragmatic strategist, a brilliant organizer who managed to turn a laboratory experiment into industrial production. He stood on the same stage, but in the eyes of the public remained in the shadow of the charismatic Fleming. It was his determination, his ability to unite people and secure funding in wartime that made the miracle possible. But the Nobel Prize, which he undoubtedly deserved, was shared. And in the public consciousness, his name would always come after Fleming's. Ernst Chain, an explosive, passionate, obsessive biochemical genius, a Jewish refugee who had escaped one nightmare and poured all his fury and intellect into the fight against humanity's invisible enemies. It was his superhuman persistence and chemical genius that allowed the isolation, purification, and study of the unstable molecule. He, perhaps, invested the most pure science into this success. And he, with his difficult character, acutely felt any injustice. The division of glory, which he considered uneven, left a bitter aftertaste in his soul. His relationship with Florey, once a model scientific tandem, over time became strained, almost hostile. Three such different men, united by one mold. Their joint photograph with Nobel medals is not only a symbol of triumph, but also a silent testament to the complex, often unfair nature of fame. History elevated one, but the real breakthrough was the work of many hands, many minds, many hearts. And the story does not end there. There is in it both a prophecy and a warning that sounds for us today with surprising relevance. Back in his Nobel lecture in 1945, Alexander Fleming, the man who started this revolution, said words that then seemed merely the caution of a scientist, but today look like a prophetic foresight. He warned the world of the danger of incomplete treatment and irresponsible use of penicillin. He said that bacteria could develop resistance to the drug, and if we use it for insufficient duration or in too small doses, we ourselves would breed an army of invulnerable supermicrobes. The time may come, he said, when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. And he, alas, was absolutely right. We live in the era he predicted. Antibiotics have become cheap and accessible. They were and are prescribed without due necessity, added to animal feed to accelerate growth, and courses are abandoned before completion. And today, the problem of antimicrobial resistance is one of the most serious threats to global health. Those very bacteria that retreated before penicillin in the 1940s have learned to defend themselves. The magic bullet is gradually losing its power. We risk returning to the dark era before antibiotics, when ordinary pneumonia or a cut could be a death sentence. And in this lies the bitter irony and the main lesson of this story. So what is this long story we have traveled together? from a Scottish farm to the Nobel Prize and beyond, really about. It is about the fact that the greatest discoveries are often born not in sterile cleanliness or according to a strict plan, but in creative chaos, thanks to acute observation and a mind ready to see a miracle in chance. It is about the fact that a discovery alone is not enough. Persistence, passion, organizational genius, and the work of hundreds of people are needed for a miracle to become a reality for millions. It is about the fact that fame is capricious and not always fair, but the true legacy is not medals, but lives saved. And finally, it is about our responsibility, about the fact that even the greatest gifts of science require from us wisdom, careful handling, and conscious use. We have become stronger, but this strength imposes a great responsibility upon us. So tonight, as you fall asleep, think about this amazing journey, about a raindrop flying in through an open window, about a forgotten dish on a cluttered table, about an absent-minded scientist who didn't throw it away, but saw a puzzle in the mold, about a stubborn refugee and a brilliant strategist who didn't let the miracle get lost in the dust of archives, about the mold ladies and engineers who turned a mystery into a conveyor belt of life. This is a story about how, in a world full of chaos and accidents, hope is sometimes born. And this hope is fragile. It requires our care,